Well, it's been 39 days since the Israel-Hamas war began, and fighting has become increasingly intense. Sadly, the conflict has now affected medical facilities and hospitals in Gaza City. According to the latest video released by the Defense Forces of Israel, Hamas terrorists armed with rocket launchers attacked Israeli troops from the entrance of Al-Quds hospital. Now, this hospital is one of the largest in Gaza, and the attack marks a new level of aggression in the ongoing conflict. As per Israeli forces,
went to the hospital with a video camera and personally documented more concrete evidence. The concrete evidence are that Hamas uses hospitals as an instrument of war. Underneath the hospital, in the basement, we found a Hamas command and control center. Suicide bomb came back from the massacre on October 7th. To this hospital, among others, after butchering Israelis in their homes, executing the innocent, murdering entire families, burning babies, burning young women alive, and uses this children's hospital, Rantisi, to hide.
So Israel has released a video to back its allegations. Now, the picture on your screen, viewers, speaks volumes about how IDF soldiers have reached the very dens of Hamas. This is the Hamas Legislative Council building, which is now under the firm control of the IDF soldiers. Israeli forces were seen posing with Israel's flag as they stood around the speaker's chair in the council hall. With major fighting concentrated in the northern part of Gaza Strip, where Hamas terrorists are believed to be holed up, the IDF has been providing safe passages for civilians to move southwards. IDF said it has been providing local tactical pauses to facilitate the evacuation of civilians southwards. Yesterday, the local humanitarian pause was upheld in Rafah between 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. local time. Thousands of Gazans moved through the safe passage under the supervision of IDF personnel. And while talking to Times Now, IDF officer Major Libby asserted that Hamas will be dismantled by Israel. Take a look at this exclusive interview.
Let's go across to Major Libby Weiss, who's joining us as spokesperson with the IDF. Thank you so much, Major Weiss, for joining us here on Times Now. Well, it has been 38 days since the war began. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza has been troubling the world. What would you say about that?
Well, first, I think it's important to clarify that we are not targeting the civilians in the Gaza Strip. And if things were to go as we have hoped, then there wouldn't be any civilians who would be injured or pay any price in the Gaza Strip. And unfortunately, Hamas has no regard for their own civilians. And we are seeing that time and time again. We have instructed civilians now for several weeks to move from the northern part of the Strip to the southern part of the Strip. More than 900,000 have moved, but we know that Hamas is making it very, very difficult for them to do so. We've provided humanitarian aid. More than 1,000 trucks have gone in with humanitarian goods. That includes food, water, and medication. But we know that Hamas has a very strong control over everything that's going on within the Gaza Strip, and certainly has little regard for the well-being of their own people, unfortunately.
Well, in fact, the IDF has said that they tried their best to send in fuel to the Al-Shifa hospital, which is, of course, the biggest hospital in Gaza. There are reports which are coming in that thousands of them have fled, but many of them cannot. You've said that there is an ultimatum which has been given repeatedly. They've been asked to move out of this area. However, many of them, and this includes babies as well, who are trapped inside, for example, the Al-Shifa hospital, those who are unable to leave and flee.
Well, we are in close communication with the heads of Shifa Hospital to find a way to facilitate the movement of people from the hospital outside of it. But again, I think this really speaks to the just disregard that Hamas has for their own civilians. Of course, Hamas is the sovereign in the Gaza Strip. They are responsible for the well-being of civilians there. And effectively, we, the Israeli military, are now the only party in this conflict that has any regard for civilians. And it's devastating and I think a huge just tragedy to the Palestinian people as well, that Hamas does not make the necessary and simple efforts that would be involved to evacuate civilians generally, and certainly to evacuate civilians within a hospital. And instead, they are using the hospital for their own terror purposes.
It's interesting you are saying that, because just now, just a few hours back, the Health Ministry of Gaza, which is of course ruled by the Hamas itself, has come out and said that of late, in one day alone, there have been 6 babies who've died prematurely. And this, as per them, the reason behind that is the lack of fuel, the lack of electricity, the lack of food, even medicines, which they could not provide. But it's quite interesting if we juxtapose it with what the WHO director has said. He said, regrettably, hospital is not functioning as a hospital anymore. What would you say about that? The fact that human shields are being used, and that too made out of babies, those who are injured, those who are stuck.
Well, I think it speaks to the depravity that Hamas has and the disregard for their own civilian population. Hamas is responsible for evacuating those civilians. We have, because we don't want to impact the civilians there, and because the goal here is to target Hamas and not civilians anywhere in the Strip, but certainly not within the hospital, we have instructed for several weeks for people to move. We have created tactical pauses to allow the movement of civilians. We are creating every possible situation on the ground to enable civilians to move and for the hospital to receive fuel, as you mentioned in your report. And the fact that Hamas is putting pressure on civilians in the hospital is criminal, and I think it speaks to the disregard that they have for their own people.
Now, Major Weiss, it's very interesting that back in 2014, you yourself were part of Operation Protective Edge. This was against the Hamas in Gaza. You were inside some of these terror tunnels that you were explaining to us about. Can you tell us what they are like, since you have been in one of them extensively at that?
Sure. So I think the best way to think of the tunnels is really to imagine that there is Gaza above ground and then there is Gaza underground. And when I went into one of these tunnels in 2014, I was struck by how advanced they were, by the engineering of these tunnels, by the concrete and the engineering that went into building them. These were impressive tunnels. All made with concrete pieces, all exactly the same size, structurally sound, were wired for electricity. It's very clear that Hamas has invested millions and millions of dollars in their tunnel network. And the tunnels that exist now under Gaza are being used by Hamas to store and to move people, weapons, supplies, infrastructure, rather than invest this money in Gaza above ground, which would be Gaza for the civilians.
To think they could have used even a fraction of this money to try and build bunkers for their civilians. But Major Weiss, it's interesting that you're giving us a detail of what these tunnels really look like. You must also explain to us what really were these tunnels being used and how deep are these tunnels? Because many have said that that may be one of the reasons, and you can perhaps tell us about it, is the reason why the IDF does not want to storm and go inside the tunnels. They do not want a full-on offensive inside the tunnels because it may simply be a trap.
Well, we know that Hamas has invested significantly in these tunnels, but we also, on the IDF side, are aware, and this is not a new threat. We unfortunately are aware of long use that Hamas has had of these tunnels, and we certainly will be prepared to handle the threat anywhere that it comes from Hamas. But I think really your comment on the investment here is tragic, and to think that Hamas could have invested, not only in shelters, but in perhaps trying to create a peaceful future side by side with us and a better reality for their own people, and instead have invested millions in the tunnels, in the rockets that they have, in all of the terror infrastructure, is a real tragedy.
Absolutely. Now, Major Weiss, President Netanyahu has said that there is going to be absolutely no ceasefire till the 240 hostages are released. Any details emerging on that? Are you really hoping that that is going to happen, which will be the only solution, the only resolution to this war?
Well, I will let the politicians sort of deal on the more political side. Our focus is on doing whatever we can at this stage and with the mandate that we have to get the hostages back. The fastest way, and perhaps it almost seems obvious, but I think it's an important message to say that the fastest way for all 239 people who are being held would be for Hamas to release them immediately without any terms or conditions or demands. These are civilians, and just last week we saw a really disturbing video that Hamas released of a 13-year-old hostage and a 77-year-old hostage.
Yes.
It's just clear psychological warfare and another element of their campaign to terrorize the Israeli public. But the fastest way for them to come home would be for Hamas to release them immediately, and for international pressure to be put on Hamas to release these civilians, a 13-year-old, a 77-year-old, a 10-month-old baby, for them to be released immediately and to come home today.
Absolutely. And I'm going to ask you this two-pronged question. First, as a soldier and also as an Israeli. How does it all end? Because we can see that Israel right now is circled, is encapsulated by this axis of evil. Of course, there are other psychological wars which are happening on social media. Let's not forget the disinformation. How does it all end? Can there be a comprehensive, a long-term solution to this?
Well, I think part of this question is perhaps for the political level and the diplomats to be able to discuss. From our perspective, the military goal is a very clear one, and that is to make sure that Hamas terrorists never harm Israelis ever again. And of course, we look forward to a day where we can live peacefully with all of our neighbors, but we will do whatever we have to defend our country and to continue living here. It's our home, and we plan on staying here.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Major Libby Weiss, for joining us. Now, that's one of the credible voices, someone who's been inside these terror tunnels of Hamas, who's telling us what hopefully is going to be a solution, a long-term solution. Militarily is going to be the end of Hamas, and nothing short of that for Israel. I thank you so much for joining us, Major, on this show.